You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at The Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today, we're going to be talking about four giants of 20th century Catholic thought: Edith Stein, Dietrich von Hildebrand, Jacques Maritain, our personal favorite, and, of course, Karol Wojtyla, also known as St. John Paul II. Our very welcome guest is Professor Rick Spinello. He teaches at Boston College and St. John's Seminary in Boston. The author of numerous scholarly articles on ethics, Spinello has written and edited many books as well, including the Encyclicals of John Paul II, an introduction and commentary, and the Splendor of Marriage, John Paul II's vision of love, marriage, family, and the culture of life. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Rick, how did you end up authoring a book on four Catholic philosophers?
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So how did I end up writing this book? Actually, I might begin just by talking a little bit about my own background and how I came to this point. I had the great pleasure of studying philosophy at Fordham University. That's where I got my PhD. That's my one link with Dietrich von Hildebrand, because he taught there. Unfortunately, he was gone by the time I got there. I just missed him, really. I would love to have taken a course with him, but he had already left. And when I went there, I was very much interested in German philosophy. I had caught that bug that a lot of young aspiring philosophers caught in the 1970s, the Hegel, Heidegger, Husserl, that seemed to be where everything was happening. But fortunately, I had these great Thomists there. The Fordham was full of Thomistic scholars, Father Norris Clark and Father Jerry McCool. I don't know if people know these names today, Father Jordan Seal. And they turned me into a Thomist. So I went in looking to study Hegel and came out a Thomist. And then taught ethics for a while, natural law, philosophy, business ethics. And my wife is the one who really got me interested in John Paul II. She kept telling me to read Veritatis Splendor. And like most husbands, I didn't listen to my wife, But finally, she persuaded me that I should read this book. And it was a great experience for me. It was, I might compare it to the poet Goethe. Goethe said that when he read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, it was like walking into a well-lighted room. And by the way, no one has ever had that experience reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But when I read Veritatis Splendor, that's what it was like. It was like walking into a well-lighted room because everything became clear to me about moral theology and its relation to philosophy and conscience. All these issues that I think had been somewhat obscure became very clear to me. So that's when I decided to sort of devote a lot of my scholarly career to the work of John Paul II, particularly his work as a philosopher, as Karol Wojtyla. And I've written several books on him. And this book is sort of an attempt to kind of broaden my perspective and think a little bit about not just him, but about Catholic philosophy in general in the last century. And also to see how he relates to some of these other thinkers like Edith Stein and Dietrich von Hildebrand. So that's how this book came about.
One Norris Clark anecdote, he was hang gliding in his 80s.
Yeah, that sounds like Norris Clark. I knew him pretty well. He loved high places, that was his thing. And he believed that if you were going to be a real metaphysician, you had to like to go up into the mountains, because he said up there you could kind of get a sense of the whole, how everything fits together. And that's sort of analogous to what a metaphysician does, to sort of get a unified vision of reality. So he was a mountain climber. So I'm not surprised that he'd be hang gliding and doing those things even when he was in his 80s. He was always very vigorous, but always thinking too. Always, his mind kind of never shut off. He was a great philosopher, a great thinker, and people should try to rediscover his writings. He didn't write a lot in his early years, but then after he retired from Fordham, he wrote a number of books that are very well worth reading.
Yes. Well, Mario, what next? We've got a whole bunch of questions we want to be asking.
Well, it's very interesting. Why did you choose these four philosophers? That's my question. Yeah. I'm curious. And another, you can comment also, what is the genre of your book? Is intellectual history? Is history of philosophy? What do you think it is?
Well, the book tries to do two things. It's a biography, so I wouldn't call it an intellectual history. It's I think first and foremost a biography, because I think the lives of these four philosophers is quite interesting, dramatic in some cases, particularly the life of Dietrich von Hildebrand and so forth. I mean, they all lived through World War II and had very harrowing experiences that they had to deal with. So it's a biography, and in addition to that, it's an introduction to their different philosophies. That's about all you can do in a book like this, because it's not written for scholars. It's written for the average Catholic layperson, if there is such a thing. I'm not sure there is, but whether that is, it's written for them, so that they might say, okay, well, at least I have a little bit of an understanding of what Edith Stein's philosophy is, and again, you can appreciate her life and what she went through, and because I think her life story, as well as the other three, are very inspiring. As far as why I chose these four, I mean, obviously there are other people I could have chosen. If you look at the last century, it was one of great intellectual vitality in the area of Catholic philosophy, because you had, Etienne Gilson and Maritain and the great English philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, Gabriel Marcel, the French philosopher, the French existentialist. But these four seem to me to be the most representative of Catholic thought in the last century, because you have a couple of Thomists, I mean, Maritain and Wojtyla. You can represent the kind of pluralistic path that philosophy took, because you have Edith Stein, who's a phenomenologist, as well as Dietrich von Hildebrand. So it gives you a flavor of what Catholic philosophers were doing in the last century. It wasn't just Thomism. So that's pretty much why I picked those four. Also, a lot of material available on these four. It'd be hard to write a biography of, say, Elizabeth Anscombe. I mean, there isn't a lot written about her. but there's a lot written about these four, and a lot of their diaries and personal journals are available. That also helps. So that was another reason why I picked these four as opposed to others. I started off, I wanted to, my original goal was to write a book on Catholic philosophers in general, to maybe cover them all, 7, 8, 9 of them. But then I said, well, that's too much. Even four is a little bit too much. So I had to narrow it down, and these are the four I ended up with.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Mario. You got a follow up?
No. Next time.
Okay. Well, you keep mentioning Catholic philosophy, and apparently there's it's kind of a contested issue as to whether there is such a thing as Catholic philosophy. And so I'm just wondering if you can shed light on why that's a contested issue. You know, what is Catholic theology, and why do people argue about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, I think. It is a very contested issue. There've been different symposia about it at universities. The last one that I recall, I didn't attend it, but the last one I recall was at Georgetown University, which had a lot of people representing different points of view. So there's two schools of thought. One is that, there is no such thing as Catholic philosophy or Christian philosophy, that there's just philosophy. There are Catholics and there are Christians who philosophize, but no Catholic philosophy. Just like there'd be no Catholic mathematics or no Catholic physics, there'd be no such thing as Catholic philosophy. And then the other school of thought says, well, there is something very distinctive about Catholic philosophy. Now, what would that be? I tried to address this in the book, because if you're going to write a book about Catholic philosophy, I think you have to talk a little bit about it. So what would it be? Essentially, at the very least, a Catholic philosopher would not be contradicting the deposit of the faith, the depositum fidei, as they say in Latin. Things always sound better in Latin, I don't know. So at the very least, you wouldn't be doing that. But I think that there are other features too, which are kind of laid out in John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. Again, another one of his great encyclicals, not quite at the level of Veritatis Splendor, but a great encyclical that kind of explains all this. And he talks about some of the defining features of Catholic philosophy, one of which was that it deals with the big existential questions that other philosophers have kind of cast aside. Questions like, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why is there evil? What is there after this life? Does a God exist? Those big existential questions that all of us have. That's how he begins Fides et Ratio, is that we all, we're all thinking about these questions. Now, modern secular philosophers of the last century say, well, we don't deal with that stuff anymore, because you can't answer those questions. They don't want to deal with them at all. If you look at the American philosophers like Richard Rorty, we can't answer those questions. We can deal with other things, but not that. And you look at people like Heidegger, they say, well, you can ask those questions, but they're not going to get any answers. So he says that our origin and destiny remain in the dark, in Dunkelheit, We're never going to be able to answer those questions. But Catholic philosophers have a kind of optimism. We can answer those questions. We do have answers for those questions. And the answers come from faith and reason. They come from the faith, which kind of gives the Catholic philosophy some content. And then reason comes in and kind of substantiates what the faith gives us. So faith and reason working together can really allow us to address these particular questions. Catholic philosophy also is definitely, as John Paul II says, he calls it a sapiential dimension, a metaphysical dimension, right? It's very, it delves into metaphysics. It's not afraid to engage in metaphysical thought, which simply means getting beyond the physical, getting beyond the empirical, looking at spiritual reality like the soul, and trying to come up with a unified vision of reality, the kind of thing that Father Norris Clark always talked about. the very big picture. God is sort of the center of the universe, the source, the summit of all being, and sort of reasoning about that. But I see that kind of big picture thing. Secular philosophers don't want to do that, but Catholic philosophy does do it. So it has a very strong metaphysical dimension, and I would say it's also committed to epistemological realism, because another problem with secular philosophy is its skepticism, its relativism. We can't know anything. You can't know this, you can't know that. What can we know? Well, we don't know what we can know. That's kind of what happens with some of these secular philosophers, and particularly the postmodernists like Foucault and that crowd. But Catholic philosophy would shun that way of thinking and say, no, there are things that we can know. God has created an intelligible universe, a universe that we can come to know through our mind. There's a kind of correlation between the mind and being. We can know these things. There's a transparency in the universe, an intelligibility. That's sort of the premise of Catholic philosophy, I think. And finally, I think Catholic philosophy overcomes a lot of the dualistic thinking of secular philosophy, which is very much dualistic. There's a dualism between the body and the soul, there's a dualism between history and metaphysics, a dualism between nature and grace, and a dualism certainly between faith and reason. But we don't get that in Catholic philosophy. We get a more holistic view of reality. We don't get these kind of reductive, fragmentary views. So I think there is such a thing as Catholic philosophy. I think it's something very distinctive. I think John Paul II said it's the way of doing philosophy. This is the best way to do it. And I think he's right. I think he's onto something.
Well, as somebody who doesn't, I'm kind of the person in the room that has no formal philosophical training beyond just a Jesuit education. But to me, it's kind of like, what's the point? If you can't talk about the big questions, what's the point of philosophy? So sign me up for the Catholic version.
Right. Yeah, good. Okay. You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. If you're just going to talk about, logic of minute little questions, what's the point? And I think students feel that way too. I teach philosophy at Boston College, and I think that they're attracted to Catholic philosophy because they ask these questions. Everybody does, and they're looking for answers. Mm-hmm. So I think that's quite correct. Yeah.
Couple of thoughts. If you asked perhaps the most influential American analytic philosopher of the last century, Willard Van Orman Quine, if you asked him, what is it to be? He would answer, why, to be is to be the value of a variable. That is to say, you can be plugged into a well-formed logical formula. Now, another more interesting background point in terms of biographical work on Elizabeth Anscombe, there are two quite new books that feature her work. One is called, and you'll like this if you are not already familiar with it, Rick, the title, Metaphysical Animals. And it's how Anscombe and Mary Midgley and Philippa Foot and one other very worthy woman whom I can't think of right now, how they really challenged the reigning positivism at Oxford and Cambridge, especially prompted by the grim reality of World War II and its aftermath. Very fascinating material. But now here's the question I'd like to ask. You're dealing with philosophers, Catholic philosophers, well-known Catholic philosophers, and truly saintly people. How about that convergence, the holiness of these people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Yeah, I'm not familiar with that work of Elizabeth. I'll have to check it out because that sounds like a very intriguing book. And those other women are very competent thinkers. Philippa Foot and Mary Midgley. I'm sort of familiar with some of their work. So I thank you for pointing that out to me. I'll have to take a look at it. So how does their saintly life and their philosophy kind of fit together? Well, I think that's really a big lesson when you look at their biographies, that there is a connection between the intellectual life and the spiritual life. That if you're going to be a competent and successful philosopher, it's very important to get the support of prayer and contemplation, which was typical of all four of these people. They were very contemplatives. They engaged in contemplative prayer, because I think that prayer and contemplation really purifies reason and strengthens it in some ways. That's something that they all saw. And reason without faith, reason without revelation, reason without the support of prayer can easily become very erratic and even sometimes violently irrational. One of the things I tried to do in the book was to contrast the way these people lived and thought before them with, again, some secular philosophers like Heidegger and Alexander Kojève, the great Hegel scholar, and Sartre and Foucault, who, in the words of Mark Lilla, who wrote this book a number of years ago called The Reckless Mind, were very reckless in a lot of their not just their philosophical reasoning, but also in their political comments, right? So not only did they kind of usher in a kind of nihilistic view of reality, there are no really fixed values, and Heidegger was an historicist, so this history trumps everything. Everything changes. There's no permanence. There's no ultimate truth, because history wipes away, what was true today, becomes something different tomorrow. But also when you look at their political comments, Heidegger talked about the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism. He went on to be the rector of Freiburg University and a big supporter of Hitler. He purged that university of Jews, including his teacher. He fired his own mentor and teacher, Edmund Husserl. Alexander Kojève talked about the universal homogeneous state of Stalinist Russia, which he admired. So did Sartre. And Foucault was a big admirer of Mao. So these guys really, again, because their lives were kind of unmoored, they weren't contemplatives, they weren't praying, they had no spiritual life. Their intellectual life, I think, goes off the rails. They end up justifying these terrible tyrannies, these terrible dictatorships. And I think a Catholic philosopher is a true Catholic philosopher isn't going to do that. It doesn't mean that they can't make errors. I'm not saying that they would be immune from philosophical errors, but I don't think that they would ever go way off the rails the way these people did.
Yes, Mario.
Well, it's very interesting, the name of this philosopher. And let me elaborate a little bit before asking a question. Indeed, these four philosophers were against totalitarianism, each one of them. Maritain changed his mind. He became what we may call, sometimes I call him a soft liberal, but he became that. The same, perhaps, with the von Hildebrand against Hitler and so on. Wojtyla against the domination of his country and so on. So it seems that their philosophy, Christian philosophy, led them to defend human dignity, freedom, truth, etc. And yet, if you examine the history of Catholic philosophy, at least in my home background, which is Latin America, many philosophers, Thomists, and some of them were not, defended authoritarian systems. Let me tell you that in 1979, many years ago, I was a young student of philosophy, very young, first course, and I traveled to Argentina to the inauguration of the first International Congress of Christian Philosophy, which was inaugurated and inspired by John Paul II election, which was in 1978. So in that place, in Córdoba, Argentina, there were many philosophers of very famous philosophers at that time. I can go on in the name of the Italians, the Spanish, American, and so on. And yet, the one who inaugurated not inaugurated, but gave a speech in front of all the philosophers was General Videla, the one who was leading the military government then. And right there where all the philosophers listened to this dictator. Some of them probably were disagree with him. Some of them perhaps have a different view about what is the view, what they call the old Christendom. So my point is that it's true that Christian philosophy may lead to people like Maritain and others, but at the same time, there are other traditions which may be indicated that we need to go back, or they wanted to go back to either the old Christendom, or like sometimes I hear today, and I have been doing research about that, a new integralism. And so my point is that sometimes when I speak to students about this tradition, sometimes I don't know what to say, because the past is also very, I wouldn't say confusing, but it's not pretty that we may want to show it is. What is your reaction to that?
Well, let me talk a little about integralism, which is sort of discussed a little bit in the book, because Maritain kind of proposes this idea that we could have a new Christendom, and a new Christendom would mean a union of state and the church. But right. he says that it will never be the way it was, and we can't go back to the Middle Ages.
Right.
What he envisioned was that the Christian principles and Christian ideals would have an influence on the state. It would have an influence on the way the state makes laws. So it's sort of a soft approach to Christendom, I think, is one way to look at it, versus the hard approach where, the state and the church are kind of fused together. It's more or less the soft approach,
right.
Hoping that state legislatures would, again, look to Christian values and the gospel for guidance in the way they create laws, in which case they would not create laws that permit abortion. We wouldn't have the French government, enshrining abortion in the French Constitution, which we're getting now. We wouldn't have these things,
right?
Because Christian values would be respected. That I think that's unlikely to happen, but that form of Christendom, I think, would be acceptable to people. I don't see that ever happening, not in the near future anyway. And I think that would be consistent with Christian philosophy, is authoritarianism, the dictatorships of Russia and probably the dictatorships of Latin America, the ones that I know of, certainly would not be consistent with Christian principles. And it would be hard for me to see how a truly prayerful philosopher would be able to support such regimes. I can't imagine a Maritain or a Stein or von Hildebrand, certainly Karol Wojtyla, supporting those kind of regimes. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
right.
Yeah, you raise a very good point, though. It's very interesting to kind of broadens our perspective a little bit to consider Latin America and the church's role there. It's which I think, as you suggest, is very complex.
Because I don't want to get into that. It's very complex, but you know that because of his view on the new Christendom, Maritain was called a heretic, and there were books written about him on that, mainly in Latin America, in Chile, and Argentina, and all that. And so they were a trend then. They were called integralist. And to my surprise, that idea came back, not in a different form. I have to be very careful about that. That came from a British philosopher and some others, and tried to somehow bring it back in a different format. Almost, I wouldn't say identical, very close to what once upon a time was the claim of the for Christendom, but in Latin America was supported by authoritarian government. And so that's for me at least, perhaps people don't have that experience, but for me at least was very disturbing in the sense that we are going to lose certain freedom. You may call liberal freedoms, but freedom of speech and so on. So it's a very complex topic, but that was my observation. So.
Yeah. Okay. Integralism has sort of made a comeback. A lot of people write about it and talk about it, and but I think it's what they're referring to now is this kind of integralism of Maritain, this soft version of it, which I think most people would find quite acceptable. Most Christians would find acceptable. It's just unrealistic that
right.
That in a secular society,
all of
a sudden, people are going to start to embrace Christian values. That's highly unlikely to happen.
Unrealistic, yes.
Yeah.
Un milagro. Valerie, lead us forward, please.
Well, I'm curious. So you're talking about prayer and contemplation as a major safeguarding against being led down wrong paths. Philosophically, I can think about my graduate theological studies, and I had several core classes with what somebody called a very seductive, charming professor who didn't really adhere to magisterially orthodox views, but it was very easy to be kind of taken in by what seemed to be solid and winsome, ways of thinking about things. And so I'm curious if there's other, beyond, of course, prayer, of course, just unity with God is going to protect us. But is there other things about these four people, or just in your own experience in academia, are there other factors that help protect people, perhaps, or help people to sort of stand against the current? Are there factors in their own life experience, et cetera, that you see? And that's just one area that I'm wondering how these four people maybe have something else in common besides prayer and contemplation, or is there other things that they have in common? You've talked about there's a certain diversity of thought representative in these four philosophers. Is there anything else as far as what they have in common that you would want to share with us?
Yeah, let me make a couple of comments about that. First of all, I think in terms of what can support us against particularly the ravages of the current culture, or even unorthodox teachers like the one you had, certainly one is just revelation itself, right? I mean, Pope Leo XIII, in his great encyclical Aeterni Patris, which was responsible for sort of the revival of Catholic philosophy in the 20th century, and particularly the revival of Thomism, talks about revelation as the friendly star. That's the guide, right? So if you come up with ideas that contradict revelation, and I mean revelation as the gospel, the word of God. This is, which ends when Jesus' life ends. I mean, we have the gospel. If something contradicts revelation, we can be sure that it's wrong. I think that was sort of one of the things that my teachers at Fordham always insisted upon. It's great to do philosophical explorations, but if you're off in some tangent and off in some area that clearly contradicts Christian revelation, you're off the mark. You've missed it. Now, in terms of what these four thinkers have in common, because they're, on one level they're very different, but they do have some things in common that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, they were all, I think, models of the intellectual life in the pursuit of sanctity. That's how I would describe the lives of each one of them. And all of them also lived the virtues, both the cardinal virtues of prudence and courage and temperance and justice, but also the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And I think that's what allowed them to really survive through the trials and tribulations of World War II, living out these virtues. And they all saw philosophy as a vocation. Philosophy was really a vocation to them. It was a way of trying to come to terms with the truth, the metaphysical truth of the world we live in, through faith and reason, always working together. One of the things that John Paul II mentions in Fides et Ratio towards the end is that the true philosopher philosophizes in Mary. This is a great phrase, and I think people need to think about what that means. This Fides, like all these encyclicals, they get forgotten over time, but he writes a few paragraphs about this. It's very profound. What does it mean to philosophize in Mary? This is so typical of John Paul II, who was so devoted to the Blessed Mother. And it means, first of all, to seek her help, to seek her intercession with her Son, so that you stay on a straight and narrow path, and that, truth is revealed to you. But it also means to be, I think, receptive of the truth, you don't want to be creative of it, create some sort of avant-garde truth, but just receive the truth that has that is kind of obvious from God's creation. So our goal is to be receptive, not really productive of the truth, but to be receptive of it. But that's something that needs a lot more thought, on philosophizing Mary. And in terms of commonality, they were all personalists. They all belonged to that school of personalism. They came at it from different points of view, but the person was very important to them. The seeds of this thought in Aquinas, but they take it much further. The idea that the person has this immeasurable dignity, that the person has to always be affirmed for her own sake. An emphasis on affectivity, which kind of gets lost with Aristotle. And in addition, when you look at their lives, they all, in terms of commonality, they all lived through World War II and suffered greatly. I mean, World War II really wrecked their lives in some ways. Three of them were converts to the faith. That's another thing they have in common. And Wojtyla, too, was sort of a convert in his own way. He had to undergo a conversion. He was a man who wanted to be an actor, right? I mean, when he left his little town in Wadowice and moved to Krakow to study at the Jagiellonian, that was his great goal. He had been an actor in high school, and he wanted to act. And you could see just by looking at him and his speeches that he would have been a pretty good actor. But in World War II, he underwent a kind of conversion. He realized, well, the world doesn't need another actor now. The world needs priests. The Polish church is going to need priests to rebuild itself, to rebuild its culture. So he had to undergo a kind of his own transformation. All of them were kind of, I would say, kind of open to the unexpected, open to the divine, So they all, and that accounts for this conversion that they underwent. I don't know about Dietrich von Hildebrand, but I do know that Edith Stein and Karol Wojtyla and Jacques Maritain, along with his wife, were very devoted to the Blessed Mother. It's interesting that they all were devoted to images of her in some distress. Our Lady of Czestochowa for Wojtyla, Our Lady of Sorrows for Edith Stein, Our Lady of La Salette for the Maritains, you know. She Who Weeps, that was Our Lady of La Salette. That had a powerful attraction on them. Why was the Blessed Mother weeping, and what could we do about it? So they all had that particular devotion to Mary, a devotion to Carmelite spirituality, which had a huge impact on Edith Stein. She became a Carmelite, of course, and that was the basis of her conversion, reading Teresa of Avila. John Paul II fell in love with the works of St. John the Cross. That was his first dissertation. And the Maritains, too, were very much steeped in Carmelite spirituality. So, and they were in their own way, at least three of them, very dedicated to the work of Aquinas. Not so much von Hildebrand. I don't think he ever really. I'm sure he knew Aquinas, but he never really wrote much about Aquinas. Though I don't think anything he wrote contradicts Aquinas by any means. But the other three were, particularly in her later life, Edith Stein became very much enamored of Aquinas. I think for Wojtyla and for Jacques Maritain, who were very creative, and they didn't just repeat what Aquinas said, but Aquinas kind of gave them his philosophy gave them a kind of intellectual security, you know, foundation. And then from there, you could kind of move out and explore different things. So those are some of the things I think they had in common. There's a lot more, I think, that people, if they read the book, will pick up from these four lives and, you know, the way they intersect and so forth. But
why are your subjects especially important for us today?
yes, so why are they important for us today? Well, let me reflect upon this by talking about something I saw recently, talk given by Bishop Barron. I assume people know Bishop Robert Barron. He gave a talk to the Knights of Malta. I think the title was "How We Got to the Present Point." So how do we get to this mess we're in? Bishop Barron's a philosopher and a thinker. So he, in this talk, which people could look at online, all this stuff is out there and available for free. He talks about four philosophers who really have screwed things up for us: Marx and Nietzsche and Sartre and Foucault. Right, so these four guys sort of made a big mess of things. I won't go into all the details, but you know, when you look at Nietzsche, I mean, he not only talks about the death of God, but he also talks about how, well, there basically is no objective truth, no objective values. We kind of create our own values. And Sartre has the same idea. That's what Sartre's view of existentialism is. You know, existence precedes essence, which existence meaning freedoms. There is no objective truth or objective values. I just create my own. I create my own way. And that's sort of the way people think today. You know, where I teach at Boston College, I mean, that's kind of the default position of young people. You know, they're pretty much relativists. And they believe that they're going to create their own values and their own life, and they don't want to be told that there's some universal value system that they have to kind of plug into and adhere to. So these philosophers have caused a lot of damage and havoc. You know, people think philosophy is it is something abstract, you know, and people think is like Nietzsche and these people first philosophize. It kind of stays within the academy, but then these ideas get out there and they have an influence. And those four have had an incredible influence, a very negative influence on our culture. So the four philosophers I'm talking about, Stein and Wojtyla and Jacques Maritain and Dietrich von Hildebrand, kind of present an antidote to that, an answer to it. You know, how do we overcome all this bad philosophy? Well, we overcome bad philosophy by reading some good philosophy. You Now, what do they have to offer? Well, I think a few things. First of all, a return to metaphysics, right? Because the philosophies of Marx and Nietzsche and Sartre and Foucault that Bishop Barron talks about are all anti-metaphysical. I mean, they don't see anything beyond the physical. They don't see the soul. They don't, they wipe the transcendence off the horizon. So these philosophers bring us back to the metaphysical, to God as the center of the universe. It's a very much a theocentric humanism. They also give us, I think someone called the anthropology of Sartre and Nietzsche kind of a negative anthropology, I think, because there's no fixed human nature. There's no human nature. There's, again, we make our own nature. But the thinkers I'm writing about believe in metaphysical anthropology. There is a fixed human nature. We do have a human nature that doesn't really fundamentally change over time. We're a natural unity of body and soul. We always have been. The soul has the powers of intellect and will. The soul is immortal. I mean, there's something about us that's immutable. Certainly we've changed in some ways, but there is a fixed human nature. And the body is a very integral part of the self. The body isn't just some appendage that we can play around with. It's an integral part of the self, the sexually differentiated body. So they give us a much better view of anthropology. That's one of I think the major contributions that they make. Another contribution that I think is very significant is the whole topic of love. This is very much in dispute today. There's so much confusion about love. We hear all these simplistic phrases: love is love, love is everywhere. We have in the works of Wojtyla and Dietrich von Hildebrand two of the greatest books on love that have ever been written in the history of philosophy. We have von Hildebrand's The Nature of Love, which is a very profound work. It's difficult, but certainly worth reading. And then the great book by Karol Wojtyla, Love and Responsibility, which I think is one of the greatest books of the last century. I'm a little bit biased, but I teach that book to my seminarians at St. John's Seminary up here in Boston, and they love that book. It has a huge impact on them. So these two books on love are very significant. That will clear up all the confusion about love that exists in the current cultures. Just you don't have to read them both, but you could read. But they kind of complement each other. It's better to read them both, but at least read Love and Responsibility, and people will know that love is not something simple. It's not to say love is really to oversimplify things and distort what love is. There are different kinds of love, and as Wojtyla says, and von Hildebrand says the same thing. There's a big difference between the love of friendship and spousal love. And spousal love, which is only possible between a man and a woman, it's only possible when there's sexual complementarity, is the only love where sexual relations really are allowable because they represent a sign and a means of this total union and total sharing of a man and a woman, which is what we call marriage. So both of them give a sense of the fact that love is complicated, that there are different kinds of love, and we have to respect the fact that love has different forms. It's not something simple. So I would say that also, those two books, very influential. What's another interesting topic that just about all of them write about is the relationship between the individual and the community and the importance of community. This is a big thing for Edith Stein because she wrote a whole treatise about this, but also for the others as well. The individuals need community. Today we have a philosophy of individualism, which sort of shuns community. We need particularly communities like the church and family and the nation, political communities. Those are very important to people. I think in the book, I talk about how, to think about what kind of person I want to be is you also have to think about to what kind of communities do I want to belong, Those two questions really go together for Edith Stein. That's why she chose Not right away, but she chose to enter the Carmelites because that community was going to be very important for her personal identity going forward. So that whole issue of the individual and community. And then finally, I would say what we need to do, again, to kind of counter the bad thinking of the Nietzsche and Sartre and that crowd, is to rediscover the natural law, which plays such a prominent role in the philosophy of Wojtyla, and particularly Jacques Maritain. Not so much, Edith Stein really didn't write about this so much. To rediscover the natural law, because if we get back to a metaphysical view of the person, with a fixed human nature, that's really a bridge to morality. That human nature that we have, the soul with an intellect and will, that body-soul composite is sort of ordered to certain goods, and it always has been. Goods like knowledge and life and health and marriage, goods that fulfill us. And that becomes the ground, the basis for moral norms and absolute moral norms, like you can never take an innocent human life. So we need to get back to the natural law and understand the intelligence of the law. Right. This all comes from God, right? God is the source of it. God gave us this human nature. God made us in a way that we're naturally ordered to certain goods that will fulfill us and ultimately ordered to Him. And so there's a certain intelligence in the way we were made and a certain intelligence in the law. So some of those things, I think, there are a lot more that we could say, but some of these issues would be a corrective to the bad philosophy, the Nietzsche's and the Sartres.
Well, those are already huge contributions. Mario, what next?
Who is your favorite among the four?
Yes, who's my favorite? Well, it's hard to pick one. Most of my work has been done on Karol Wojtyla, but I would have to say, after doing all this work on this book, I have two that I'm gonna point out, and it's the two women, right? It's Edith Stein and Maritain. You can't really do the life of Jacques Maritain without talking about Reyes, because they were just inseparable. That becomes clear when you read my book or any book any good book on the Maritains. There was something about both of them that I found to be very moving. They were both deep contemplatives. Both of them were very forthcoming in their journals and their writings. And I think they both wanted to sort of bring contemplation back into the heart of the Catholic Church. So they're very, I think, very inspiring in their own way, and their stories are very touching. So I'd pick those two. What about you? I could ask you the same question. I don't know if you want to.
I wonder if Valerie wants to jump in at this point.
Well, as far as favorites, I don't have one because I haven't thoroughly explored them. But one question that I had, I got to reading some of this book that you've written, and I was reading about the sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the names. Reyes. I keep thinking Pieper for some reason. But yes, in their marriage. So you've written an entire book about John Paul II's, treatment of marriage and the significance of his vision and his philosophy in that regard, his theology. And in reading your book, I was very fascinated to find out that Jacques and Reyes had embraced continence and marriage prior to their conversion. It sounded like, and if I got that wrong, no.
It was right around the time of the conversion. Yeah, I mean, I think they might not have officially been baptized, but I think when they did that, they were sort of on the road. I mean, sort of. Remember, it takes a little bit of the conversion experience begins when they visit Leon Bloy, and they begin to think about these issues. So I think they're on the road. I don't think they were necessarily baptized, but they were certainly on the road to conversion when they decided to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just thought it was interesting because I'm always thinking about our culture and the way, what is the solution? How do we affect the culture in terms of this kind of entitlement to sexual behavior that's kind of reigns in the popular mind, that people are just entitled, in a sense, and there's no sense of like, why would you give that up, And so I thought it was interesting. I was just curious if you've contemplated or had any thoughts on their own kind of journey in this regard, because I think a big element of, John Paul II's theology of the body is just this idea that we don't use people, right?
Right.
We don't
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I thought it was very interesting that, in a sense, as I read in your book, my sense is that they were determined not to use one another in marriage, in a sense that they didn't want to fall into a mentality towards one another that would perhaps weaken their love in some way. But I don't know if I misread that or misunderstood that part of their story.
Yeah, I'm not altogether sure. It's hard to know exactly why they chose to do it. I mean, they did believe that this is what God was calling them to do. The reasons behind that, I don't know if it involved, they didn't want to end up using each other. It could have been that way, but I mean, that wouldn't happen in a Christian marriage. I mean, as long as they're open to life, as long as they're giving their whole selves to each other, which I'm sure they would have done, they would have avoided the kind of use that Wojtyla was talking about. I'm not. Yeah, they don't. To the best of my knowledge, they don't really elaborate on why they made that choice, and it's something they don't say. They don't say, "Well, this is the way married couples should be." They certainly don't say that. They just say, "Well, this is for us because this is what we believe God's calling us towards."
And I think the tradition affirms that there's a place for in marriage periods of time if you feel a call to a higher thing. But I don't know. As you've studied, John Paul II's work, that question that I have: how do we reach the culture? Are there things that have come to mind to you? How do we reach the popular mind with a vision of sexuality that is beautiful enough to draw people into the truth and the light with regard to?
Well, I think what he presents in Love and Responsibility, the idea that our sexuality is a sign and a means of this total gift to the other. That's what it is, right? That there's such a thing as spousal love. So spousal love means I give my whole self to the other person, and that includes my fertility, my sexual powers, everything I give to the other. This whole idea of a mutual self-gift that's permanent, that lasts forever. I don't have to worry about my spouse running off with the secretary or some guy she meets at the bowling alley or whatever. This permanent union, I think that's a pretty powerful image for young people. And it gives sex a meaning that it doesn't have now, because if it's just something trivial, it has no meaning. So at the very heart of Love and Responsibility is the discussion on spousal love, which I think is very attractive to young people. I mean, I'll tell you this. I mean, it's a hard sell at Boston College. It's because the seminarians love it, but teaching over at Boston College, that's a tough story for them to accept, because it's so countercultural. But some of them certainly, after thinking about it and reading it, I think come along. So it's a great battle, but I think books like Love and Responsibility do help in that regard, and they do help give an image of, again, spousal love, which should be attractive to everybody.
We're, I'm so sorry to say, close to the end of the hour. However, we have a kind of nascent tradition on our show of a pop quiz.
Do I have to take the pop quiz, or?
If you walk through the open door,
you should.
You are subject to the pop quiz. I'm going to read a passage from author X, and I'm going to ask you folks who you think the author is of this passage, and it's certainly apropos to what we've been just now speaking of. Love is not concerned with qualities. They are not the object of our love. We love the deepest, most substantial and hidden the most existing reality of the beloved being. This is a metaphysical center deeper than all the qualities and essences which we can find and enumerate in the beloved. The expressions of lovers are unending because their object is ineffable. Love seeks out the center not to be sure as separated from its qualities, but as one with them. This is a center inexhaustible of existence, bounty, and action, capable of giving and of giving itself, capable of receiving not only this or that gift bestowed by another, but even another self as a gift, another self which bestows itself. Not Foucault, that's for sure.
No, it's not Foucault.
Not Sartre, that's for sure.
No, it's none of those people.
Sounds Wojtyla to me.
Well, Wojtyla complimented the author of that passage. That's Jacques Maritain.
Maritain.
Jacques
I
Maritain.
wouldn't have guessed that. That's pretty good. I knew it didn't sound like Wojtyla, but I would not have guessed Maritain.
Yes. There's so many things in Maritain that other people sometimes say, I wish Maritain had said more about. And he does say a great deal about them.
Right.
To go from the sublime, I think the sublime, to the absolutely weirdly trivial of our time. We have this truly noble Russian dissident. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name properly, Navalny, who was in effect cruelly executed by Putin. After a lot of controversy, he was allowed to have a public funeral. At his funeral, a song was played. I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra. Now, if anything could be more jarring than that, I don't know what it is. We have our culture's post-flood. There's all sorts of flotsam and jetsam and junk and garbage just cruising over us all the time. And I think that's an illustration of it. But at the end of our program, we always return to our source, which is the gospel. And the gospel for today is from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick, for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure for me too. I enjoyed it very much. Yep. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
And the next book is in draft form on your desk, I'll bet you now.
Of course. Yeah, right here. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. And when you finish, let us know and we'll invite you back.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. All right.
Thank you so much.
See you. Bye now.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization, and don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.